Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome a friend of mine, musician based in New Orleans, Mr. Seth Hitsky.
Yeah.
Mr. Seth, thank you very much for joining me under the Human Right Tree.
Thank you, Mr. Alpha. I'm glad to be with you again. It's been many years since
Yeah,
we've had the chance to be face to face like this. So it's great to see you.
it's a pleasure. My first question will be, were you born a musician?
Yeah, I think so. If I don't know if you can say born a musician, but I was born both to a mother who was a musician herself and loved music very much. And music has been sort of passed down through my mother's family. Um, somewhat on my dad's side too, but really a lot on my mom's side. And she noticed when I was very young that I had a good ear for music, that I would sing harmonies with the radio in the car. And I so since I was at a very young age, my mother encouraged music with me.
Where was it? Was it in New Orleans or
No,
London?
I was born in the suburbs of Detroit, just outside of the city of Detroit in a city called Southfield.
How was it growing up in Southfield?
Nice. It was very suburban. Um, my parents, my parents were both grew up in the city of Detroit, and then when they married and started to have children, they moved slightly outside of the city, and that's where they still live now. And so that's where I grew up. But so it was, I think, in some respects, like it was a safe place to grow up. It wasn't the poorest and it wasn't the richest. It was somewhere in between. And but the my parents purposefully chose an area with a really excellent school system. So my brothers and I was the middle son of three sons, and we had a nice education thanks to my parents' ambitions for us to have a nice education. And we grew up with really great friends and good experiences, positive experiences.
I see. There is a African saying, often a tree cannot stand without its roots. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and how your background shaped the person you are today and as a musician?
Yeah, huh. Well, I come from a Jewish family. My mother and my father both are Jews and children of Jews and children of children of Jews. And at a time when they were both, I guess you could say, second and in some cases third generation immigrants to the United States. My dad's parents, my grandmother, my dad's mother was born in Europe in kind of on the border of Russia and Poland, and her family fled that area and came to the United States to get away from the pogroms that were happening. And my mom's parents were both born in the United States. So their parents, my great grandparents, were fleeing Russia and Poland for the same, and not just Russia and Poland, but mostly Russia and Poland for the same reasons. Um, because the Cossacks were happening, the soldiers at the time were ransacking villages and making it very uncomfortable for Jewish people to live there, and so they fled. They fled, and they were able to come to the United States, um, which is why I'm here.
Yeah.
So to get back to your point and how it relates to music, well, my as much as my mom, encouraged music and gave me music education at a young age, but even before that, where I started to take piano lessons, but before that, we sang in synagogue, and we had a really wonderful cantor, the Jewish singer that leads the prayers in synagogue, named Chazan Louis Klein, who really was my first music teacher, because we sang in the boys' choir um, in synagogue, not just me but my brothers as well. And he was a wonderful singer, and I really learned about singing and from him and from his style. Um, he was a musician. He wasn't a music teacher, and I sometimes I feel like those can be two different things. But he was really a musician, and he didn't teach me technical issues with music, but I listened to him and how he sang, and I learned how to sing from listening to how he sang. So uh, I think that that's how music has always been, also for me, intertwined with religion. Um, I'm not a very religious Jew, um, and yet I think the parts of that I'm most attracted to about the tradition and the faith are the music that has been passed down, the music that accompanies the prayers, the music that's been passed down to me through my involvement with synagogue when I was young.
So I'm guessing you are in New Orleans now. At certain point, you left your suburb. What
Yeah,
made
yeah, that's
you
right.
leave, and where did you go in the first place?
Yeah. So I I kind of always knew that I didn't want to stay in the suburbs. I think, I had a good group of friends, and we were all very creative and dreamers, and from I think from what we saw in pop culture, in movies and TV, and also in what little traveling we had done with our families and with school, we saw other places that looked more exciting to us. One of the Chicago was one of the first big cities outside of Detroit that I had the chance to visit. We were in middle school, and we took a class trip, and we got to go to Chicago and see the city and see some plays. And I was really inspired. Even, I think I was maybe sixth grade or seventh grade, and I was so inspired by the city of Chicago and how it looked to me like kind of an ideal, a place that was built and designed to be a coming together of people from all different backgrounds, cultures, um, working classes and rich people, and that the city, to me, it seemed obvious walking through Chicago that the city was made to be a place where people come together and learn from each other.
Mhm.
And that was so exciting to me and so inspiring. And so I think from that age, from as a middle schooler, I really started to dream about moving to the city. That being from the suburbs was fine, but it wasn't but where the world was really happening was in the city. So Chicago was an initial draw to me, definitely, and then it was freshman year of high school. I got to take a trip to New York for the first time, and really, really was drawn to New York City as well. So when I was in the suburbs of Detroit up until through high school, graduating high school, um, and by that time I had already been playing in some bands, but also had become interested in theater and in musicals. And I attended some arts camps in Michigan, and eventually was kind of recruited, but also very interested in attending the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor for music and for musical theater. And at the time, I really thought, oh, I'm gonna go to this musical theater program and train, and then I'm gonna move to New York and I'm gonna be on Broadway. That was my goal at the time.
Mm.
And I went to that great school and made some great friends there too, and had some wonderful teachers, and had the opportunity to both train in singing and dancing and in acting, but also to take a wide variety of classes outside of just the arts, with really wonderful professors at Michigan, all different kinds of disciplines and backgrounds. And I had a very diverse education. And during my time at that school, at the School of Music at Michigan, I kind of um, was reminded or discovered that I was maybe not as interested anymore in theater as I was in really concentrating on music. And I was part of some really excellent bands of fellow musicians who were students there, and became really inspired to make original music and to try to make our way playing original music. So we graduated from college, and the band that I was in, we really wanted to keep playing together, but we were ready to leave Michigan. And some of us wanted to go to New York, and some of us wanted to go to LA, and we ended up going to Chicago. And that was back in 1998.
What triggered the choice though?
What's that?
What triggered the choice of
It was a
Chicago?
little, it was a band. And as you know, as we played together too, and we'll talk about that, but bands can have a band leader, but there's a certain democratic element to being in bands, like
Yeah,
in the end, everybody gets something of a vote,
yeah,
because, and I think it's natural, everybody's contributing musically. So even if you never say anything, well, I think we should do this, I think we do that, you're giving yourself musically to something, and it's having an effect, right? Like
yeah,
absolutely. So not to try to be too deep about it, but we it was a compromise. We all had been to Chicago and we liked Chicago, and the elements in the group that were wanted New York, or the elements that wanted LA, had to sort of compromise and say, well, Chicago. Well, the other, I think there was another shrewd kind of choice too with it, which was that we knew there were some clubs that we were playing in Detroit and in Ann Arbor, and we knew if we lived in Chicago, we could still easily travel back to Michigan to play shows, that we didn't have to give up those gigs. And those gigs continued to be really good gigs for us. When we lived in Chicago, we really supported ourselves somewhat by going back to Michigan and continuing to play, because we had good audiences in Detroit and in Ann Arbor. So that was it was a compromise for the band, and it was also a practical kind of move. I think you probably know there's like a lot of it's very natural for people in Michigan and in Detroit, if you want to make a move, and there's a lot of opportunity in Chicago. It's a bigger city, and
yeah.
it's a natural move to go to Chicago and to find more opportunity. So I guess that's the story.
I see.
Mhm.
Um, Take us back in the beginning. Um, what was the name of your band, and how do you end up creating the band? What was the process of
Okay.
getting into band, and what did you learn from being part of the band? One of the things you learn for sure, there is a democratic process involved.
Oh yes.
So, what
Yeah.
was the name of the band, and what kind of music did you play?
That band was called Machina, and
Mhm.
it was a band that came out of a special kind of time in the 1990s for rock music. At the time we called it alternative rock. And if Machina was part of like the larger umbrella of alternative rock, Machina was alternative rock. It was very kind of experimental. We didn't have a guitar player. We had this very talented trumpet player who used a little very tiny microphone in his mouthpiece of his trumpet, and processed digitally with old 90s digital processing, processed his trumpet signal, his sound, into all of these effects to make his trumpet sound like a guitar most often, or really like anything he wanted, but like a very uh, uh, rock kind of metallic kind of guitar. And so it made our sound, our overall sound as a group, very unique. And I learned from him. And so as I was the vocalist for the group, and I would do a lot of playing with effects with my vocals too, putting them through multi effects and processors from the time. And it was a very unique band. It was not a kind of a mass appeal band, but it was a band that was born, to get back to your question, uh, out of the School of Music. Really, it was thanks this particular project. A lot of bands form because of the band members or the band leader said, "I want to form a band," and they start looking for people and they put it together, and that's how things happen. Or they have some songs or a style or an idea that they want to a band to project. And so that's how it begins. In this case, it was a little bit more complicated or sophisticated because it was a band that came out, that was born in the School of Music at the University of Michigan. There's the jazz program that they have there, the main jazz program that they have, that if you're a jazz major, you would go through, is kind of normal for jazz programs around the United States, where you learn big band music and you learn bebop and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and all of these kind of major jazz history styles and musicians. But the head of the program at the time was a really wonderful professor named Ed Sareth. And Ed both had the ability to lead the jazz program at Michigan through those sort of normal mainstream jazz kind of styles and disciplines. But he was very interested himself, being a musician from the 60s and 70s, of free jazz and free improvisation, and fostering creative musicianship and creative consciousness, things that he was very interested in. And so the Ed Sareth, as the chair of the jazz program at Michigan, also led a large free improvising orchestra, not jazz, but free improvising orchestra called the Creative Arts Orchestra. And that's a group that still exists at the School of Music at Michigan. And it was through that free improvising orchestra, which I had the honor and happy time to join, that I met the other musicians who would form our little band. So it was and many of our audience at the time, when we were just getting started, were fellow musicians, all different kinds of musicians from the School of Music and around Ann Arbor, who we were sort of a musicians kind of band. People would come see us and we would do kind of crazy, sophisticated musical things. And so in a way, kind of to make ourselves laugh, or to see what we could pull off, or to see what we could get away with. And musicians love to come kind of, see us and be in on the jokes and enjoy this sort of preposterous thing. It wasn't commercial in any way. I say that because I think eventually, when I look at my whole trajectory, where I've come to and where I kind of wanted to get to, and even that band where we wanted eventually to get to, was to be more commercial, because we wanted to make our living as musicians, which is a difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah.
And especially when you're trying to do it as with your own original music, it's really, really, really difficult. And you have to be very lucky, and amongst other things. Did I answer your question in there somewhere?
Yeah. I'm wondering, how did you come up with? When did you create the band? How do you come up with the name? And
Ah,
who were the members of the band?
so uh, the so it we we formed because it was like an assignment kind of. That Creative Arts Orchestra was going to have a concert with smaller groups. They wanted to do smaller, like where people who were in the orchestra could have smaller groups, and there would be a concert where you could play with these new smaller groups and put on a show, do a couple songs. Well, the other three musicians, not myself, who knew each other already, were the trumpet player named Mark Kirschenmann. Now he leads that Creative Arts Orchestra at University of Michigan now. He's a
Okay.
professor there.
Mm.
Then the drummer was John Maloney, who's a good friend, and we ended up playing more together. He's still a professional drummer based in Chicago. And the bass player's name was Alana Rocklin, who I had the pleasure of reconnecting with just recently. Alana now plays with a very big touring group called STS9. And she just came through New Orleans, so I got the chance to hear her play. But it was the three of them, John, Alana, and Mark, who wanted to do, they wanted to do kind of a normal sort of rock performance of playing some like normal kind of classic rock, like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, stuff like that. But they wanted to do it with Mark playing his trumpet instead of having a guitar player. They thought it would be this kind of cool thing. And they decided they wanted a singer. And I was recommended to them. I was playing with a group that I'd been playing with since high school, and we were playing in Ann Arbor. And I think it might have been my cousin who was also a musician and in the School of Music at the time. And she recommended me to them because they were looking for a singer. Somebody did, I can't remember. So that's
Mm.
how I met them, those musicians. And we did that one performance together, and everybody freaked out because it was so exciting, and it really went off well. And we realized that we wanted to do more together, that we had a great uh coming together of a band, and we wanted to make it something.
Chemistry.
So
Mm.
the name was Machina, which actually Alana, I believe, was the one that proposed that we use the name Machina. And she was aware, I believe, that Machina was also already the name of a band, a popular rock band from Israel.
Okay.
And Alana named like just proposed that we name the band Machina. She didn't think it would be an issue because she didn't think anybody in the United States really knew that band anyway. She only knew about them from having visited Israel and seen them in concert. And we also did a very funny spelling of Machina
Okay.
in order to not get in trouble. We spelled it Maschina. And then
Okay.
that's how we came up with the name Machina. And it's funny because eventually Smashing Pumpkins, who were a big band out of Chicago, eventually had an album called Machina. And I think since then there have been more Machinas, which is good. That's less less trouble for us. Not that it matters anymore. But yeah, so we were called Machina, and really it was that first concert that was so exciting. And then we played some parties, just like at friends' houses, and we really had a good time with it. But it was that we knew we wanted to write original music. And it really was Alana and myself, the bass player and I, who got together and started writing songs at first. The band, we would get together and there would be riffs, and we weren't the only contributors, but there was definitely the engine that kind of made the band really something that we all cared about so much that eventually we left school together to go do it. That
Mm.
was because Alana and I put in a lot of energy together,
Yeah.
both creatively, getting everybody, getting the songs, our own original songs, um, off the ground, and also promoting it and trying to get us booked into clubs and to do more. So
How was the process of creating your own song? Can you take us through the
yeah, so
details?
I have to go back a little further. Is that I was talking about what good friends I had back in the suburbs in Detroit, and one of my best friends still to this day is a guy named Jeremy Schulman, and we were the exact same age, and we met I think in fifth grade, and became good friends. And Jeremy, um, I had my background was singing in synagogue, and then also I began at age 7 to have formal classical piano lessons. And Jeremy had classical guitar lessons. He was a guitarist, and but Jeremy, I don't know who got him into writing songs, but he would write music on his guitar. And I showed Jeremy, I think it must have been in 6th grade or 7th at the latest, some poems that I'd written. I had been writing poems, and he liked what I'd written. And he took some music that he had written on guitar. He really only had to do this one time, but he did it one time. It was some kind of miracle or trick that we pulled off, where he liked a poem that I'd written. I'd written this poem about how there were more and more lights in the city and less stars in the sky. This image that you're seeing, the lights of a city coming on, and because of all of these bright lights in the city, all these dots that look like stars, but they're not. It's the city, and you can't actually see the natural stars anymore. Um, and he really liked that poem, and he found a way to take one little phrase from it and put it and match it to a riff, some music that he wrote. And when he showed me that he did that he took my words and he put it to his music,
Music. Yeah.
something went off in my head, something very important to my life. And I realized that we could make songs together. And so for me, it was never something I did alone. It's always been a collaboration. And Jeremy would write music, and I got very comfortable, even at that early age, of singing, kind of improvising um, melodies and coming up with melodies to go with the music that he wrote on guitar. And then the last part of my process was to fit lyrics to what we'd come up with. And it was almost always, I think to this day, it's always in that order for me.
I see.
So I did that with Jeremy when we were kids. And then when I was at school and Machina was formed, I did that with the other members of Machina. We would write music. I always felt very confident in finding a melody to sing over whatever they came up with. And they were such good musicians and would do all kinds of, sophisticated polyrhythmic things and harmonic things. And it was fun for me to try to figure out how to make a melody sit on top of all of that. And then, yeah, so that's kind of how it would come together.
I see. How was your debut in Chicago?
How was my
Uh,
what?
debut, the start,
Debut?
yeah, debut
Oh,
in
with that
Chicago.
band or
Yeah, coming to Chicago,
yeah,
have a
yeah.
band and
So we
trying to make it.
so we finished our education in Ann Arbor, and we decided we were going to move to Chicago.
Okay.
And something I remember in a way very fondly, because I think it says something about Chicago, is we were all very concerned. We really wanted to move there, and we didn't want to have to do other kinds of jobs. We really wanted to like get the gigs going so that we could make money as musicians. So we were calling lots of Chicago clubs. We'd already been to Chicago a few times to play, I think. I'm not sure about that, but we called a bunch of Chicago clubs trying to get booked. And I remember we called, oh, I'm sure it still exists. There's a club out on Belmont, kind of west out on Belmont. I can't think of the name of it right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if it still exists. I'd be disappointed if it doesn't. It's always been a good club. One of these places that gives a lot of bands their first gig in Chicago. They really take a lot of chances on new bands.
Okay.
But we called them because we heard this about them, and we called them. We said, we're moving to Chicago in the fall. This was still the summer, whatever, of 1998. We're going to move to Chicago in the fall, and we want to book a show with you. And he said to us, the club owner or the booking agent, he said, "That's great." He said, "Call me when you get here." And I mean, he might have had all kinds of reasons for saying that. But what the message that I took from it, which really kind of felt true for a lot of my experience as a musician in Chicago, was Chicago is very supportive of Chicago musicians, and they want to talk to you and they want to work with you when you're there,
Okay.
like and we got there and we got settled, and he stuck to his word. He got it. He gave us a gig. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't think of the name of that club, but there's we developed really nice relationships with several clubs all around the city of Chicago.
Okay.
Um, and some of those friendships that developed with booking agents and people who were around music in Chicago, including yourself, I absolutely still have to this day.
I see.
Chicago, I lived there and worked on that band Machina from 1998 until I guess that band broke up sometime in late 1999 or 2000. And then I moved. I left Chicago in the summer of 2000, and I moved with some fellow musicians to New York, and I lived in New York for a few years. And but eventually, I made my way back to Chicago in 2005, and it was somewhere around then, 2005, six or seven, I think maybe six, when you and I met.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and then I lived in Chicago again until I moved here to New Orleans. And that was from 2005 until 2011 is when I left Chicago and moved to New Orleans.
How was the transition from Michigan to Chicago for the people who didn't have the chance to live in musically in both cities? Is it there are a lot of similarities, or you believe is quite different?
Uh, well, it's almost like comparing three things, not two, because there's Chicago and there's Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is, and then there's Detroit.
Okay.
And those are three very different places with three very different music scenes. And
Can you enlighten us a little bit about those
all of them
differences?
great, all of them great, but just different.
Okay.
Um, uh, Chicago is by far the biggest and has a very large community of musicians with lots of different little scenes. You can play music, you can be a blues musician in Chicago and not really cross paths too much with people who play in, pop cover bands or people who play original music, or people who play jazz. It's big enough that, like, on the one hand, musicians are musicians, but on the other, you really might not meet plenty of musicians in Chicago who are just like you, making their way musically in the city. But it's a much bigger city.
Yes.
Um, the smallest is Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor is, I think in part because of the University of Michigan, and the University of Michigan having such a nice long history of lots of smart and creative people going through both as students, but also professors, and also just people who live in the city, and aren't necessarily connected to the university. Um, Ann Arbor is a small music community, and you might be playing a style that nobody else is playing in Ann Arbor. To this day, I think that's true.
I see.
And there's a little bit of, there's the townies that we used to call them, the people who just live there and work there, versus the very, very tight knit and concentrated group of musicians who are students at the University of Michigan, who often are only there for 4 years and then go on to who knows where and who knows what. So it's a unique situation, Ann Arbor. It's kind of a test tube in a way.
I
But then
see.
uh, Detroit is wonderful in its own way, and it has its own. It has jazz and it has blues and it has lots of rock in Detroit, and lots of original music. And I think what's great about Detroit is people. There's a real spirit of making something. This is true in Chicago too, for different reasons. But in Detroit, truly, there's this kind of spirit of making something literally for yourself. or maybe for, just for you and your friends, or just the people, like, there's it's not as ambitious, generally, I think, musically. There's more secret experiments, I think, that happen in Detroit, because it's so off the beaten path. Um, but that said, when you look at the history of all the bands that have come through Detroit, from Motown to Parliament Funkadelic to all of the rock bands, and then into the '90s with the White Stripes, and like it's incredible, what a unique and specific style Detroit has. My only thing, I think, I consider myself a Detroiter, I consider myself a Chicagoan, I consider myself a New Yorker, and I consider myself a New Orleanian, because I have really given myself to each of those places, both living there, as well as given myself musically to each of those places. So I feel very comfortable kind of saying that, as many as it is, like four cities that I kind of call mine, but I really do. And Detroit has a very unique style. Chicago is more diverse, musically, but Detroit has a very kind of special uniqueness to it.
I
So
see.
I'm proud of that, for Detroit. Like, I like that about Detroit.
When you come to Machina,
Uh-huh.
eventually your journey together ended, and you
Yes.
decided to explore your own path. What was the reason? Because I feel like young musicians may listen to us, and I think they deserve, um, you know, they deserve the to learn about how bands get together with a lot of ambitions and eventually end up breaking up and people going to different directions.
Yeah.
So
No, so
what was the reasons?
it was a successful band before we moved to Chicago, when we were still in Ann Arbor, and we were playing mostly in Ann Arbor and Detroit, but doing some really good gigs. And we made an album, and we moved to Chicago, and we continued to hold on to those gigs in Detroit and Ann Arbor. I specifically want to mention one club in Ann Arbor, which still is going strong, called the Blind Pig. And we would come back once a month to from Chicago to Ann Arbor. We would play one show a month at the Blind Pig, and we would make enough money to pay our rent. And we were very proud of that. Like, we did a bunch of other gigs too, but it was really a very proud thing for us at the time. Well, we I think the longer we were in Chicago, um, we uh, we were very hopeful still for our ambitions about the band. And we did have a few little meetings with people from major record labels. Like, our real hope was that we could get signed by a major label, and they would pay for us to make an album, and they would basically pay for us to tour, and that we wouldn't have to have side jobs, which we did have to have side jobs in Chicago. I worked at Whole Foods Market. I worked at a as an assistant at a graphic design firm in the meatpacking district. Um, our bass player, she was, I think, working as a secretary for a recording studio. Our drummer was teaching, in teaching music in high schools, and our trumpet player wasn't working, but he was the only one of us that didn't graduate. He was still working on his doctorate. He was a doctoral candidate back at the University of Michigan. And so two things happened. One, we didn't have any luck getting signed. It also came at a time when it was sort of the end of that era, where like there was like a lot of money for in A&R, in artists and what did they call that? I don't even remember. Representation, I think, where like where record labels were putting up a lot of money to develop new bands. Um, we had by that time played some shows in New York City and around the country. Like, we really put ourselves out there. But I think also we didn't really have mainstream appeal, I don't think. And we started kind of trying to write new material that maybe we thought would give us a little bit more mainstream appeal. And it wasn't really working out, like, for us. So that was sort of happening. Creatively, we were kind of at a crossroads. We didn't really know. We wanted things to improve. We wanted the band to grow and to be successful, but we weren't able to figure out how to make that happen beyond what we'd already done, beyond touring what's called the Rust Belt, playing shows in Chicago and Detroit and Wisconsin and Minnesota, around the Midwest. Aside from doing that, like working a job during the week and going and getting in the van for the weekends and going somewhere and playing gigs,
Mm,
we couldn't really figure out how to take it to the next level.
I see.
So we were sort of running into a wall, we felt. But then consequently, the bigger deal was that our trumpet player was needed to get back to Ann Arbor to complete his degree.
Mm,
He had gotten married, and he was married to a woman who wanted to be in Ann Arbor, and they wanted to start a family. And the
I
rest of
see.
us were not really at
Keen.
that point in our lives. We when we moved to Chicago, we lived in a house together. We lived in one of those houses they call coach houses in Chicago, like a house behind a building. And so we didn't really even, only 2 years into living in Chicago, just 2 years out of being college students, we were still very much trying to figure out what to do with ourselves.
Yeah.
How to make a living if we were going to be able to be professional musicians, what that was going to entail, how we would be able to do it.
Mm,
There was a lot going on, but our trumpet player having to move back to Ann Arbor really was the thing that's
big
why the
one.
band fell apart.
I see.
We had ideas that we were going to still keep it together, and it was once we weren't able to all be under the same roof working on it, that was the end.
Oh, and I see.
So
Eventually,
what I would
go,
say is,
mm,
to answer your question a little bit as far as like addressing younger musicians, I, bands often become like families. And literally in our case, we were living in a house together. We were really a family.
yes.
And when I've had some very difficult romantic breakups in my life,
Yeah.
but breaking up with a band, or a band breaking up, in a way it's worse, because it feels like your family is breaking up,
I
and
see.
that's uh, pretty traumatic.
Yeah.
It was not fun. I'm happy to say that on some level or another, everybody in that band, maintains relationships to this day, like stays in contact, even though we've all kind of moved on to our own things.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was a pretty bad breakup. There was a lot of finger pointing, and
I see.
blame, and I was in my early 20s, and there was some pain from that time that I still have scars, I feel like, from that
Yeah.
band breakup.
But eventually you managed to keep in touch.
Yes,
And so
yes,
it's a good thing.
that is.
How was your move to New York?
Yeah, so I was playing. So this was after that band broke up, and I was working at Whole Foods Market. And at that time, I would like to think that still that's the case at Whole Foods Market, but I can't say. But at that time, working at Whole Foods Market was a great way to meet people. Like you meet artists and musicians and yogis and
Yeah.
dancers, and Whole Foods used to be a great place. I think because it's because it was came out of being a natural food store, and lots of artists are interested in natural foods and organic produce, and
Yeah.
and eating healthfully, and eating in a way that's mindful for the planet. And so it was a great place to meet, to network. Not that we considered it network, not that it was like that level of a business thing, but
Yeah.
just to meet fellow
People.
artists. And
Yeah.
I met lots of friends and artists and musicians who I'm still friends with to this day, including at that time, a great artist and musician and DJ and music producer named Daniel Givens.
Okay.
And Daniel, originally from Milwaukee, but had been living in Chicago for many years, and was a great DJ, very involved in DJ culture in Chicago, worked at Gramophone Records, which is a very famous DJ record shop still going in Chicago. And we became friends, and then, working together at Whole Foods, and started talking about music as we, and that was right. I had just broken up with Machina and was hurting from that, but very interested in creatively and working on some new music. And I thought I wanted to join a new band, or I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I met this collaborator, and Daniel both introduced me to a lot of music that I did not know, including some things you and I have in common. I learned about Fela Kuti from Daniel. I learned about reggae music and all the history of Jamaican reggae from Daniel. And I learned about house music and underground dance music from Daniel Givens. So he was a very important musical figure in my life. Meeting him was a wonderful thing, and we began to get together. And he showed me some recordings that he had been making, and he showed me how he did start out as a drummer, but I didn't see him drum too much, although he did play a lot of hand percussion. But what he really did as a DJ and as somebody who knows about dance music production was he used recorders and samplers and drum machines, and he created recordings himself with all of these music machines, and then also with all kinds of percussion and African percussion. And so he was really making a record, and he had a relationship with a Chicago independent record label who were interested in releasing his music, and he decided to include me in that process and to use my singing as part of his music. And it was also because of my relationship with him that I met a lot of great Chicago musicians, some of whom are very famous Chicago musicians for their contributions to all different kinds of styles in Chicago, like guitarist Jeff Parker, who I got the opportunity to play with at that time, and Nicole Mitchell, wonderful flautist. I think she no longer lives in the city, but she used to live in Chicago. And Josh Abrams, wonderful upright bass player, jazz bass player, who played with Daniel, among many, many other musicians as well. But those are some very kind of well-known Chicago musicians who Daniel introduced me to, and I got to collaborate with through my relationship with him. So we worked on music together in Chicago, and we made some recordings, and we played some shows, and had a band that Daniel led called the Age Ensemble, the Daniel Givens Age Ensemble. And we both kind of, I think I knew once Machina broke up that I already had kind of the inkling in my mind, because I was in the New York faction when we were originally deciding where we wanted to move. I wanted to actually move to New York, and didn't go because we decided as a group to be in Chicago. Well, Daniel had been in Chicago a long time, and he was looking for a change. And I think he also had an inkling that he was making this music and these musical projects that he was doing. He wanted to take them to New York and to see what would happen to them if he brought his stuff to New York. So we made the decision together as partners to leave Chicago and move to New York City in the summer of 2000, and take our music and take our lives and take ourselves to New York City, and to see what we could do in New York, like a lot of people do. We took our dreams with us, and we moved to New York.
How was it?
Very, very exciting. Daniel's dad helped us, rest in peace, move in a big moving truck that we rented. We stopped off at my parents for one night in Detroit, and in Southfield, and stayed the night there. And then from there we drove to New York City. A friend of mine from college let us sublet his apartment in Manhattan. And so we moved in, and we didn't, once again, I moved to a place without really having much of a plan, like something that I think people still do that. move to New York without a plan, but man, I can't imagine doing it twice the same way because it's every year New York's a more expensive place to live, and
Yeah.
if you don't have a plan, it can be
Rough.
pretty scary. It's like we spent a few months subletting my friend's apartment in right above the East Village in and right below Murray Hill. What is it called? In Gramercy Park, and it was on 21st Street between Second and Third Avenues, and it was exciting. And being near the East Village was very exciting because it's a really fun neighborhood full of interesting people and clubs and things. And it was that, so that was exciting. But we very quickly ran out of money. Had to figure out one how we were going to make money and where we could live, where we could survive. So we knew we couldn't stay in my friend's apartment. Well, Daniel also had a friend who was an expatriate from Chicago, a fellow DJ and a photographer and record store person named Jeff Alborez. And Jeff was living in Bushwick in Brooklyn and had some space for us to move in with him and his roommates. And now we were really piled in to an apartment that I think had like one real bedroom or maybe two, and then one like kind of a closet that had been made into a bedroom. And we lived in this old tenement building that I would be shocked if it still exists, off of the L train Montrose stop in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And so then finally we were kind of able to kind of get settled. At first I was trying to do what I did in Chicago a little bit, which was do temp work, like secretarial work around New York, but the jobs were very strange and random. Like each one was very different, and it was hard to find some consistency. But then Daniel started working at a really great record shop in New York called Other Music, and which was pretty near the East Village. And at some point, he was walking around the East Village, and he noticed on First Avenue and Seventh Street that there was a health food store called Prana Foods, and that Prana Foods was looking for some new employees that they were hiring. And he told me, "Oh, you worked at Whole Foods. Why don't you go and try to get a job over there so you can make some money?" And that's what I did. I started as the assistant to the produce buyer at Prana Foods in the East Village. And so having that little bit of a job and having that little bit of a place to live,
Yeah,
I
it
was
can help.
able to get settled in New York.
So, how was the project? Were you able to succeed in your goal, or you end up hitting another wall?
I did kind of in a way, I hit another wall. Um, Daniel and I, we made kind of like we made some good records together in Chicago, and I think living in New York together, we were able to make maybe one. Well, actually, we didn't move. We took a trip back to Chicago and recorded one more work. It was like a double EP of recordings that we after it was after we moved to New York, but we went back and we collaborated with a Chicago engineer and studio, Doug Sharon, from him, and I don't know, lots of other great projects. And we and so that was kind of the last thing we did together. In New York, we sort of started to kind of grow apart creatively. Daniel was making a transition from doing more music in Chicago, which was sort of based in free jazz and using kind of free jazz musicians to collaborate with. And in New York, he became more interested in connecting to hip hop and hip hop producers and rappers, and which wasn't really where I was coming from. And I think that was kind of like we started to kind of grow apart
I see.
creatively. So, which I, at the time, I was kind of hurt and frustrated and, didn't know, I felt like, well, he doesn't want to work with me anymore. But I think, in fact, both of us, it was just, he was interested in doing this. And I was, really didn't know what I wanted to do at that point.
I see.
Um, not that I had any failures in New York, because I really don't feel that way at all. I lived there for 3 years, from 2000 to 2003, and it was a very magical, inspiring time for me. In fact, in some respects, I think some of my friends would say it's like I was there in a way for like an education kind of. Um, I didn't. I think there was a part of me at the time that felt like I was a failure because I wanted to have a band, and I couldn't figure out how to make a band happen. But despite that, I was really sort of rescued by the underground. Daniel was a DJ and Jeff was a DJ, and then I met New York DJs, from living in New York. And while I don't think of myself as a DJ, really, I guess in a way, but I don't focus on that so much. Um, I danced my way through New York City for 3 years and learned, well, both met wonderful DJs and dancers, interacted with them, and danced to, all kinds of wonderful music that I never would have known about except for living in New York and being a New Yorker and being a New York dancer. And so in I say this, and I'm not always referring to the same thing, but I feel like with New York City has a tendency, people come with their dreams and their ambitions. And I think some people really do kind of, if you're strong enough and you have a strong vision and you're lucky and all things go right for you, you can sort of take that dream that you had and make it a reality in some fashion. If you're lucky and if everything works out, or you have a lot of money or all of those things. But my experience was not like that. My experience was New York, me thinking this is what I wanted, and New York saying, well, this is what we want to do with you.
Yeah,
And and if you're flexible and you listen and you respect kind of, New Yorkers and New York culture, you can really learn something and grow and transform as a human being from living in New York City. And I feel like that's what happened for me. So musically, it wasn't, the story that would eventually come, and, to where I am now in New Orleans, and all of those original dreams that I had that I eventually was able to realize didn't really happen at that time in New York. However, um, the influence that New York had on me and has on me musically, is forever, like is very strong. And as from all of that dancing I did when I lived in New York, I've absolutely grown as a musician. So
I
so there's
see.
that. Now the other aspect is I lived in New York through that was 2000 to 2003, and I was there during 9/11. So I think maybe that had a big effect on me as a person,
Mm,
um, living through that trauma in New York,
I see.
and probably part of my reason for leaving when I left was to sort of recover from the experience of being in that city when that happened, and living with it and living with the consequences and the changes that happened as a result of September 11, 2001.
I see.
So yeah.
Yeah.
And, anyway, that's a
Mm,
long story too, but yeah. So even though I was only there for 3 years, it and I think in part because it was 3 years when I was in my mid 20s, which I'm sure, as it can be a very influential time for a person.
yeah,
My short time in New York had a big, profound effect on me, I feel.
I see. Eventually, you left New York, you came back to Chicago,
Yes.
and you choose to go to New Orleans.
Yes.
Tell us the reason you choose New Orleans.
So I guess it always kind of comes at these times when when I'm kind of running into a wall a little bit, like I'm running around in circles, whatever metaphor you want to use. But just to back up a little bit, I moved back to Chicago in 2005. And part of my reason for going back to Chicago was to reconnect with the drummer from Machina, with John Maloney. And we ended up forming a project, a band called Mastrueno, with a bunch of people Chicagoans who we knew from the Ann Arbor music scene from years ago. And that, as big of a deal as Machina was for us at the time when I was younger, Mastreno was something that we lasted for like 6 years or something. Like it went, we had a nice long run and we played a lot. It was during that time that I met you and played with the Princess of Futa and met
Mm,
Hashim Okta, who
mm,
remains a friend to this day too, as well. And I had a very good experience playing music in Chicago from 2005 to 2011. That said, I was still not able to support myself with music. And being a professional musician, not having to have all of these different kinds of side jobs that I've had to have throughout the years was always a goal. And, for some people, it actually really, it's a reality, and wonderful music and wonderful musicians come out of playing music when they are able to and free to and having another job, much like yourself.
mm.
You have a very serious other profession, which I remember you were still just studying and getting ready to enter when you and I met, of
Yeah,
being an attorney, but in the United States. But so there's great musicians and great music that happen from people who are not professional musicians. Why I It was like the grass was always greener for me. I saw that there were people who could make a living doing it, and I wanted to be that person. And I don't know that that's the I don't know. Yeah, I guess I don't know that there's a higher motivation for wanting to be a professional musician, but that was the motivation, was because I would rather make money playing music than do all these other things that I had been doing to make money.
yeah,
So it was kind of that simple. Well, I think if I had stayed in Chicago longer, maybe I would have figured out how to do it, because I do have plenty of friends in the music community in Chicago who are professional musicians in Chicago. And what I came to eventually in New Orleans, and the way that I make a living now in New Orleans as a musician, I could certainly do in Chicago, under different circumstances. I just didn't know at the time. It's just the way things went, the circumstances of and fate of my life. But what happened was I was working a job that I'd been working a long time in the loop, and I was kind of bored of it. It was making enough money to get by, not a great amount, but not a terrible amount. I was able to support myself, and then playing music when I was able to, and it just wasn't enough for me that I was spending 9 to 5 Monday through Friday dreaming of playing music. I wanted to be doing it all the time. And I hadn't figured out how to make that happen in Chicago. A friend of mine was visiting New Orleans for work and had like a hotel room with an extra bed, and he said, "Why don't you come to New Orleans and hang out with me and check it out? It's really a fun city." I'd only been one other time to New Orleans to play a concert, but it was in the summer of 2000, and it was for one night at this club called the Rusty Nail, and I didn't really get a chance to see the city. Had I seen it at that time, I think it would have connected with me. It must have, but we were just in and out so fast that it didn't. Well, when I visited, because my friend was working, and I stayed with him at the hotel, and this would have been in 2011, I think, or 10. Immediately, I felt like I found the answer to what was ailing me. Like, Chicago felt like I was kind of going around in circles a little bit. Um, I missed New York still, and some of the energy of kind of the streets in New York City, and I felt that energy in New Orleans in a way that I didn't feel it so much in Chicago. Maybe in part because Chicago is a colder city, and we spend a lot of times getting from one warm place to another in Chicago,
yeah.
except in the summertime. But
Mhm.
there was a street life in New Orleans that really appealed to me, and this notion, I saw that there were musicians who were playing and gigging and and doing well and able to have opportunities for themselves, and the spirit of New Orleans music, which is a spirit of celebration, really appealed to me. There was
Mhm.
something about that where in Chicago, I was feeling a little bit like, oh, you could do these creative things, but then you sort of have to explain them. People like an explanation in Chicago. Well, why are you doing this? What's it for? And then you kind of describe and uh, what it is you're doing and what your motivations are for doing it. Well, New Orleans, it felt a little more natural. It's just, Mardi Gras happens every year because people love Mardi Gras, and it happens every year. And we dress up in costumes, and we wear masks, and we parade, and we have music, and we dance, and we celebrate because it's fun and it's what we do. And just like we enjoy cooking here and celebrate, the taste of food. And like New Orleans is it's not a wealthy city. It's not a big city, but it's a city, I guess, in a way like Detroit, that has a very specific character to it. I think even more so, to tell the truth. New Orleans has a unique character totally unto itself, and it visiting, it really appealed to me, and I thought, wow, I really could move to this place, and I started dreaming of leaving behind the job that I was doing in Chicago, and picking up and making my way to New Orleans to be a musician in New Orleans. And that's
When
what
you
I did at the end of 2011.
in 2011, how was the music scene in New Orleans, and how were you able to fit in? Because were you able to play rock music like you used, or you have to kind of adapt yourself to the new music scene?
Both things are true. I wasn't actually what I really wanted when I in moving to New Orleans, I wasn't really interested in playing rock. Um, I was interested in being in becoming a better keyboardist.
Okay.
Um, when I was with Machina playing in rock bands, I kind of abandoned my keyboard playing, my piano playing, and when I moved back to Chicago in 2005, and I started this band Mas Trueno, and when I met you with the Princes of Futa, those were my first real opportunities to play keyboards with bands. I was I had done a lot of singing, and I was kind of less interested in working on my voice and more interested in becoming a better keyboard player.
Instrumentalist.
So
Yeah.
yeah, becoming a better keyboard player to me meant more learning more about jazz and more about music from around the world, and less so about. It's funny because really now you can almost call me a rock keyboardist, but that wasn't really like in my sights at the time. When I moved here, I really wanted to learn jazz and funk. There's a big jazz scene obviously in New Orleans, and a big funk scene in New Orleans. And when I came here, and to this day, Frenchman Street is one of the little scenes in the city, and with a lot of clubs all right next to each other, and you don't have to pay a cover charge. You just go in to any one of the clubs, and you hear all these great bands.
Yeah.
And it turned out at that time, and to this day, not true of every band, but a lot of the bands and musicians playing on Frenchman Street were musicians who were new to the city. It was like an entryway in a way.
Okay.
And when I came here, I was Frenchman Street was everything to me. And the musicians that I met there were, that was really the musicians I wanted to interact with. And my first um, real paying gigs in New Orleans were playing some of the clubs on Frenchman Street.
I see.
Eventually, I played with a few bands that I met through some jam sessions, and much like is happening right now for me, under circumstances of the band maybe was going to fall apart, we were going to lose the gig, I took over and became the band leader to kind of keep things going. So that formed a band that I led for a few years called Black Dragons, and we eventually made an album that I'm very proud of, that I produced, called Seth, Hitsky, and Black Dragons, Rain All Day. That's like an instrumental jazz funk kind of album. And but eventually I was waiting tables and still kind of, like, how am I going to
Mm.
make this transition? I could see it that there were other musicians who uh made that transition and were able to do it. but I couldn't. I hadn't gotten enough gigs, regular gigs, to be able to do it. Well, eventually, some of the other keyboard players who knew me, there was a really good keyboard player here, still working and wonderful, named Phil Breen, and Phil had enough gigs that he was playing some gigs on Bourbon Street and needed somebody to sub for him for one of those gigs. And I went and I played my first gig on Bourbon Street, I think 11 years ago now. And at the, it was called the My Bar at the time. I think it's still called My Bar, Tickler's now. It's like a piano bar now, but it used to be, it was with a rock band. And that was the first time I got hired to play a regular multi-day gig, like where it was like we did 3 or 4 days a week of playing on Bourbon Street at this one club. And we were paid a certain amount of money an hour in addition to tips. And I was able to start making enough money that I didn't have to wait tables anymore. And I finally made this transition to being a full-time musician. So it was thanks to discovering and being discovered by the Bourbon Street scene in New Orleans, which is a lot of different style bands, but my experience has been a lot of cover bands, and playing all different kinds of styles of music to cater to the tourists who visit Bourbon, mostly tourists, but not all, but mostly tourists who visit Bourbon Street because it's this world famous spot. And that's really Bourbon Street, and my association and my being hired by Bourbon Street cover bands was the transition that I needed in order to become a full-time professional musician.
I see.
So and so I wasn't able to do it with creative music or original music, which is something that I'm still very committed to this day. I love creative original music, and I continue to make it myself, record it when I'm able to. But my goal of being a professional musician was realized by learning how to be a singer and a keyboardist in cover bands.
I see.
Which is funny because when I lived in Chicago, it never would have dawned on me to do that, that would have been a path to supporting myself musically. But it took moving here and Bourbon Street to make that happen.
As you emphasize it, New Orleans is a city of celebration. However, recently there was an incident in which a person drove a car and went randomly on killing people. How that event affected the music scene in New Orleans?
Um, it was it's funny because I was very close to what happened, both because I was working that night, only a few blocks away, from the where the man's van, where he drove over people. But also, even kind of more eerily, he had planted 2 bombs which did not go off in these rolling coolers. And one of those he planted right outside of Crazy Corner, which is the club that I play at. He put it right outside the door of the club. And I, at the time, was 10 feet away inside on stage at my keyboard. So that was very shocking and scary for not only the musicians of the city and the musicians who work on Bourbon Street, but also all the staff, the bartenders, service people, all the people we work together with at the clubs. It was terrifying. In fact, one of the door people, this nice woman who I work with, actually met one of the people who eventually would be killed by getting hit by the man driving the van. And it was being very close to something terrible that happened. Now, for me personally, having lived through 9/11 first years ago, and I wasn't in the buildings or even too near the buildings, but I was in, I was 20 some odd years of age, 24 or 5 at the time, and was walking the streets of I was walking the streets of Manhattan all day on 9/11 by myself, trying to make my way back to Brooklyn, and spent literally all morning and into the afternoon walking the streets of Manhattan on 9/11. So in a way, it was my second time living near a terrible attack like that. And something unexpected, unwanted, and violent happening on such a large scale um, in a city that I lived in.
Mm.
And I can say that I think having lived through it in New York and as a younger man, and then having lived through this in New Orleans now that I'm older, in a way, sadly, I guess I was I guess my skin's a little tougher about it somehow, having already been through something similar once.
Mm.
And but also being kind of a party professional now, and who, someone who I mean, someone who makes a living entertaining people and giving people their good time, whether it's for their vacation or their weekend or whatever.
Mm.
And to have a place like Bourbon Street that's supposed to be, and New Orleans, it's supposed to be about celebration and it's supposed to be about having a good time together, um, be invaded by something so horrific like that and something so violent. Um, this time I felt a little less in my feelings and a little more resolute. And I don't know if that comes from being older, if it comes from having lived through it before, if it comes from the fact that now not only am I supporting myself, but I have a wife and I have a 5-year-old daughter. And, we bought a house this past year that, we are making regular payments on. All of these things made me want to get up off the ground and do what we do, and give people the opportunity to keep celebrating, and to reclaim Bourbon Street as a place of celebration, as a place of joy, instead of as a place of tragedy or as a place of violence. Um, I just felt very determined to um, reclaim that space for what we do with it. Um,
So,
I guess is how I felt about it.
yeah, it's quite interesting how you brought the two events together and having to face them.
Mm.
The other question I would like to ask is, um, in your journey as a musician, as a young man, and today as a musician, you are a father. Does a family, being a father, being a husband, and having to um, not just being responsible for yourself, but knowing there are other people who count on you, does that affect your musical journey?
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. I've had to make lots of decisions um, about both uh, taking jobs, staying with bands, maybe where like I don't love the music, or it's like not exactly what I want to be doing. I don't love the band leader. I don't love their style, but I want to
Right.
do a good job. Yeah, it's like you do start to, it's more of a job. It's more, you know, I, I think when I was younger, and I see this with younger musicians here, they don't like something, they're not happy with kind of the situation. They just pick up their instruments and they go away. They say, well, forget this. I'm going to go, do it somewhere else. And I used to be that way. I really used to be that way. Like if I didn't like it, I left, and I was lucky, like in many instances, I something else came along. Well, I can't afford that anymore. Like I
Mm,
really I've learned how to I've developed the skills necessary to um stay in situations longer than I used
mm,
to work with people who maybe I used to find more difficult to work with, or too different from my style or whatever. To be flexible in the way that I play, and the music that I play in order to cater to the needs of a specific band or a specific gig, because this is my profession now, and I'm doing it
mm.
not just for me but for my family.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a transition, and it continues to be.
Mr. Seth, thank you very much for taking us in this journey. It
Yes.
was a, a learning experience, and I'm grateful that you took your time and you know shared your experiences. Despite you see, in some instances, you see as a hitting a wall. But I believe that you never hit a wall because the whole journey is there for you, for us to learn and meet people and better ourselves. In that, um, if there are young musicians that have the desire to continue to pursue their belief and dream, what kind of advice are you going to give them as a closing in to our conversation?
Never stop playing. And something that a great dance teacher from college always professed to me, which was the power of persistence, of perseverance. She said perseverance, and I believe, yeah, perseverance is true. And I think as you go on in life, and hopefully you're lucky enough and you take good care of yourself and you get to live a long life, uh, you you kind of leave breadcrumbs for yourself. You leave clues for yourself. It was not music and me wanting to be a musician. It was not this unbroken line, like there were times when I was caught up in other things, or interested in other things, and it really took me kind of looking back at various points and realizing it's like, oh, I if I really think about it, music is really important to me in life. And if I really look back and I think about it, I've really given my life to music, but that took years. That took years. And
Mm.
I do firmly believe that people who have other things that they do with their life can still have really, really beautiful musical lives that are just as meaningful and important as anything that a professional musician has the opportunity to do. So I would say to any young musician who really is concerned about their music, and that always being a part of life, to never stop, just to keep playing, through good times and in bad, through up times and down. Your music can be with you for your life, and it's really, to me, it's the most wonderful human gift.
Mr. Steph, thank you very much. Keep playing is the last word.
You too. You too.
and
Thank you,
yeah,
brother. Thank you.
and let's keep in touch. Mm.
Please.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.